Okay, so today's episode of Parenting in the Trenches is a bit of a bonus episode because we are piggybacking and going more in depth on a topic we visited last year in our Neurodiverse Families series when we were exploring the impacts of trauma on our kids' brains and how our kids' brains shape and develop over time. And because there was so much to cover, it was a little bit high level and we kind of stayed there. It also preceded the publication of Dr. Geddes' book, which is called Children and Complex Trauma, a roadmap for healing and recovery, which has now since been released. So we thought it was really important to come back to this topic and maybe choose something that we could really uh, chew on, something that had more depth to it that helped us understand some of the context and concepts that are helpful for helping our kids heal when they've had really trying circumstances and they've felt unsafe for a period of time. So this conversation is really going to be helpful for people who support kids who have had those experiences in their past, and who want to be part of their healing journey. So Dr. Chuck Geddes has worked extensively in the fields of child and youth mental health and child welfare for over 15 years, serving in various clinical roles, including supervision of staff and interns. He completed his PhD at Colorado State University and has his MA from California State University in Fullerton. Dr. Geddes became interested in the role of complex trauma in children's neurological development through the work of the Child Trauma Academy, Dan Siegel, and others. He developed the Complex Care and Intervention Program, which we like to call CCI because that's a bit of a mouthful, right? As a way to embed a trauma focused therapeutic perspective into the care of children in the foster care system. Dr. Geddes provides education and training to social workers, foster parents, and mental health clinicians all across the province of BC in Canada. Helping adoptive parents who adopt children from traumatic backgrounds is another area of growing interest. And Chuck and his wife, on a more personal note, have 3 adult sons, one of whom has special needs. And in his spare time, Chuck will often be found hiking, biking, and my favorite, playing old timer hockey. Gives it away. For people who aren't visually seeing you, you can't get away sounding young. Is that the deal? uh, it's so good to have you back. Thanks for being here again.
Thank you very much, Karen. I'm glad that we're going to get a chance to dig in a little bit deeper on some of these ideas.
Yeah. Today, we wanted to really hone in on the stress staircase. It's one of those nice concepts actually that we can put on paper. So I've got 2 offices that I'm working out of, and in my play therapy, family therapy office, we have multiple copies of this pinned up on our wall. And we refer to this because it's so kid friendly and it's so adult friendly, and it's therapy friendly. So I refer to it often. And so this feels fun to me because we get to really dissect it, take it apart, and understand it better. So maybe can you give an overview of what the stress staircase is? Is it something we all have? Is it only certain people who have it? Um, and what does it look like specifically for people who have experienced trauma?
Sure. Well, I think I really like the idea of the stress staircase because we've tried to take some complicated ideas and make them as simple as possible visually.
Yeah.
And we all have the experience of having different degrees of stress in our life any given day,
Mm.
and so we find ourselves maybe sort of increasing in stress. We would say moving up the stress staircase. And one of the things that we're trying to communicate is that as that happens, there are physiological differences and there are neurological differences that start to happen within our body. So as I get more
Mm.
stressed, I'm I tend to become more kind of vigilant and worried and seeing threats, different places. I might not even think of them as being a threat, but I tend
Mm.
to kind of be responding more and more from my lower brain rather than my kind of higher or upstairs brain, my thinking brain. And so as I'm more stressed, we all know this, as you're more stressed, you tend to react quicker, perhaps get angry, things come out of your mouth that you didn't expect to say. And so
Yeah.
those are kind of common experiences that we have, that we all have. And I think that we also if we know ourselves a little bit, we understand there are certain things we can do that help us come back down the stress staircase.
Hmm.
You know? And I think probably going through the day, we probably most of us would wake up, what we would say kind of in the green zone. You're kind of waking up and you're a little bit mellow, and then you start thinking about the day coming up, and that the, the thoughts of that increase our arousal level or our stress level that we're experiencing. So I think that's something that we all experience, and it's a nice way to think about what we as the adults are experiencing, and then what the children we're caring for are experiencing as well.
When you were talking about that, I was thinking about when trauma actually feels so unsafe in our bodies that we separate from it. So when you were saying, we have these reactions that we're not thinking through, we just do them. It's it reminds me of that lack of insight that we have in those times, because that's not the part of the brain that's operating. It's not the insightful brain that understands what's happening or making choices. It's just operating out of survival, right? And so some of these confusing things we see in our kids, sometimes we're baffled. We're like, how do you not know that's not okay? Right? Like, oh, why are you choosing to hit? Why are you that this is not going to serve you? How do you not understand? Right? In the moment it feels illogical, irrational, and kind of obvious. Um, but isn't that true that like there's no access to that part that can temper or help us make really good decisions? It's not that our kids don't know that it's not okay to hit, right?
Yeah, there's a number of different things you're bringing up here that are interesting. So, one of the things is we all are aware of this survival brain that we have. That is where when we're under threat, that there are these kind of primitive mechanisms in our brain that will try and take us to a place of safety. So they start to change our physiological system.
Mm-hmm.
It gets us ready to move to this fight or flight or even a freeze, kind of playing dead kind of place.
Yeah.
And so we are aware of these kind of survival things that could take over if we're under a high degree of threat. What we tend to think is that all of us, including the kids we care for, are going through the day not with the survival brain active, but rather with the kind of logical part of the brain. And
Yeah.
so then, as a parent, we can look at a child or a teacher, look at a child and think, why are they doing that? That doesn't make sense. Like you said, and why aren't they able to see and understand that that's not an okay behavior, that this isn't serving them well, that this actually will end up with problems down the road. But as you
Yeah.
said, that's not, as we get increasingly stressed, it's actually that survival part of the brain that's kicking in. And I think for children who've experienced complex trauma, so multiple types of traumas in their life, particularly in the first 5 or 6 years of life, one of the things that happens is that the brain's survival mechanisms get set on high alert. So they're much more, um, their brain is kind of patterned, learn the pattern or the habit of I need to scan the environment. I need to see what might be coming at me, and and it very quickly kind of sort of takes over. So that survival mechanism, actually, with many of our children that we care for and help to care for, I think that that survival brain is actually the thing that's kind of driving them through the day for the most part.
Yeah.
The logical part of the brain's there, but often is kind of pushed to the background.
There are times of day that I often hear parents say or feel the worst, the hardest, the most challenging. And that came up for me as you were talking. I was thinking back to a conversation actually I had last year with Kim Bartel, and she was talking about sensory overload and how if you pretend you're kind of hitting a bit of a restart button on your own system every night when you're sleeping, and you wake up in the morning with a bit of a fresh bank, right? And then this accumulation of we're trying so hard and working so hard to tolerate our environment, but that builds and grows and accumulates in us to the point where we hit all of a sudden this threshold where we can't cope. We can't cope with the input anymore. And when you're talking about that, that's what I picture. I picture this like overflow state where we can see kids. This happens when they come home from school. They've tried so hard all day to hold it together. Um, or bedtime, right? They're just fried at bedtime. Everything's hard at bedtime. And it's
Mm-hmm.
hard for us at bedtime because we have also tried to track and been there for and stayed calm and been the supportive one, and we have our own capacity, right? And so we hit those points. But I think about how that overload takes a toll on our own system. Even when we're not in traumatic circumstances, we are kind of re-experiencing that to some our, just on paper, our nervous system is in overload, trying to cope with not being in overload.
Yes, very much. And if we're not careful about that, I think our stress response, or if our child's feeling stressed, then their behavior is getting a little more difficult, and they're maybe not reacting in that kind of logical kind of way. And we go up that stress staircase right along with them at
Yeah, we
times.
do.
So now
Yeah.
we've got parent and child both
Mhm.
trying to get through this when we're both in that kind of reactive part of our brain. So I like one of the things that you brought up, Karen, is that idea of that almost like a reset. And so one thing that we found to be really helpful is that idea that it's a parent's job. It's going to help your child if throughout the day we can keep having these resets. So
Mm,
otherwise, if you think about this idea of the staircase, as the child's going through the day, they're into they're adding sort of a burden on their sensory
yeah.
systems, right? So that's both the sensory kind of overload. So getting to school, it's noisy, it's busy, but it's also the threat piece of
Yep.
that. Schools
Yep.
are, I think, a highly stressful environment. You're worried
Yes.
about, you know, what do my peers think of me? Am I being included? Am I being excluded? Is someone laughing at me? Do I
It's
feel
constant, isn't
smart?
it?
Constant. And so I
Yeah.
think, that does take a huge toll on our kids. And so if we're able to sort of think in terms of how do we help them to get this reset
Hmm.
over and over and over through the days, that we're going to be more successful. They'll be more successful because we've helped them to take a couple steps down the stress staircase. And when we again, if we think about kids who've come from traumatic backgrounds, when we end up talking with caregivers and staff that are in a school or other people that know the child well, they're often describing a child that's almost vibrating. So the
Hmm.
child's just under, whether we want to call that stress or we want to call that anxiety or whatever we want to call that, they're kind
Yeah.
of vibrating a
That
lot of the time. So
energy.
they're on edge, they're tense, they're expecting bad things to happen. There's a whole big load there. And
Yeah.
so that child is right on the edge often of that being flooded. It's too much. I can't manage this, whether it's relationships, sensory overload, emotions. It's too much for me, and my brain will take me to that place of fight or flight or freeze. And so, and that happens very quickly. And you hear, I'm sure, all the time of people saying, "Oh, that child just goes from 0 to 60 in a
Exactly.
blink of an eye."
That's right.
Yeah, and
So
actually,
fast.
yes, and but instead, we really should be thinking about, this child's running at 45 all the time.
All
That's
day.
their baseline.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't take very much extra to push them to that point when they're at 60 and now they're
Mm,
kind of in the red zone and you get the fight and flight kind of responses. But if we can help to reset that a little bit lower, then
mm,
we could talk about some strategies to do that. But if we
hmm.
can reset that a little bit lower, they'll have a little more time to think first, to seek support first, to using a um, calming technique
Yeah.
before they're into that kind of red zone and blasting.
Yeah. Can before we get to the strategies, can you help us understand um, how uh, how personalized the stress staircase is? Like, so I'm thinking from a practical perspective. My kid's stress staircase has different signals attached, so I would label each step maybe differently than another parent who sees their kid going into overload. We have unique things that we how the way we take in the world, right? So depending on what I've experienced, but also depending on what's happening in the moment and how that affects me, what I consider perceived stressful, hard on my system, is going to map out my stress case differently than it will be the next person's. How do you go about mapping that? Is there a process that parents can use or to go through to decide what that looks like for their kids?
That's really interesting. I like that idea of I guess it makes us to be kind of a detective, doesn't it? In a sense,
Yeah.
with our kids, that we need to be curious and not assume that um, a particular situation is either not stressful for them, or that the things that are bothering them in that situation are the
Mm.
same as what would be bothering us. So
Yeah.
we've used that idea of kind of being a detective around what helps your particular child, because there's different things you can do. We want to be kind of that curious detective to sort out what's helpful to your child. But I really like that idea of kind of putting that on the other end too. Like, okay, how do I know and recognize that
Hmm.
my child is moving up that stress staircase? What's it look like? Is that, their face goes beet red? Is that
Yeah.
the opposite, where they seem to go quiet, go internal? Like, what are the signals? Because that's going to be different for each child. And then,
Hmm.
what is it about that situation that's causing the stress? One of the things that you mentioned earlier is that idea of sensory overload
Yeah.
after your conversation with Kim Bartel. And when we've got children who had really difficult experiences during pregnancy or
Hmm.
in the first few months of life, so this can include a parent who is um, a mother who was under stress during pregnancy, maybe was couch surfing, maybe was abusing substances, maybe there was domestic violence, malnutrition, all those kinds of things that would have interrupted the child's development
Yeah.
during pregnancy or in those first few months after pregnancy. I think often what happens is the child's nervous system, in terms of um, receiving the input, the sensory inputs from the world, hasn't developed well. And
Hmm.
so often I think those children are running through life or moving through life with struggling to kind of cope with all the sensory inputs. And so we don't even think about that often
No.
with kids. We just
Right.
assume they're doing okay.
Yeah.
But whenever I see a child's history and I see these prenatal problems
Yeah.
and early first few months out of the womb problems, I wonder how they're managing sensory things. And if we don't ask, we often don't hear that. But when we
Hmm.
do start to ask, wow, we're hearing all kinds of, it's sort of this background noise that the child's coping with through the day of trying to manage what that sound and that light and this commotion and
Yeah.
this touch. And sometimes that's kind of running, a little below the surface, but it's leads to the dysregulation that we see.
Hmm. It feels so much more empowering to me as a parent when it feels concrete. Like, so if I know what my child's cues are, because like what you said a few minutes ago, like these are kids who go from 0 to 100. We don't have a ton of time. Right? So if we're going to go early intervene, right? We want to catch it as quick as possible to kind of reset or come down a couple steps on the staircase. We don't want to wait until they're in this high red zone where they're past the point of being able to connect with us. So we know that it's better for everybody involved if we can detect it earlier, but that's tricky. So I know that in correlation with that, that if I do know, I feel that much more capable of helping and intervening and doing the right thing in the right time, right? But without that map, I feel like there's so many versions of what stress can look like in a person that it really does need some attention, I think, on our part to customize that for our kids, so that we are doing it for our that's attuned to our child. It's not just a generic map that a book has provided, right?
I think I come at this just this little bit different perspective, but I think
Mm.
about the children that get referred to us. They're
Yeah.
really struggling, right, at the time when
Yes.
they're referred to our program,
Yeah.
and everybody around them is struggling. But my assumption is that for most of those children, they are high up on that stress staircase most of the time,
Right.
and so rather than sort of playing this kind of a game where we're trying, I shouldn't call it a game, rather
Mm.
than trying to sense that my child's more stressed. I just assume they're all stressed. So we
Okay.
sort of take the approach of, instead of let's watching for that eyebrow to raise or the face to get a little bit flushed and then think I need to do something. Let's
Mm.
just assume that they're all carrying more stress than they can manage. And anything we can do that's going to quiet down their stress response system, quiet and move them down that stress staircase, that's going to help with emotion regulation. That's going to
Yeah.
help with academic success. That's going to help with their ability to connect with you.
Yeah.
Because as you said, once they're in the red zone,
Yeah.
all bets are off.
Yeah.
Uh, so we really think about, how do we just prevent on a preventive kind of basis,
Mm.
go there first, and
Okay.
to sort of help that child's uh, baseline to be
Yeah.
a little bit lower, right?
Yeah.
So
So you're
yeah.
you're talking the platform piece. Yeah, I'm thinking more in heightened moments, or how do we detect in a day what that staircase looks like for a kid. But
Mhm.
you're saying we also have to assume that they start with a platform halfway up that staircase, and that's actually really critical. You're saying that's what's really important, that we pour our resources into helping the the basement level that's currently half up the staircase. We want to lower it.
Yes,
Did I get that
absolutely.
right? Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, so talk to me about of strategies then. What are, have you come across that feels effective in moving the that platform to a more basement position?
Okay. Let me add one thing just as I
Sure.
go to do that. So, and that's the idea that, when we see children, the more dysregulated the child is, the more they're struggling to manage their emotions and their behavior, the more we feel like we need to do this. So we're going to be doing it in every situation, every case. We're going to be working on these things, but it's almost like, the more dysregulated the child's getting, then over time, then the more we need to do these things. And so, we might, with a typical parent, we might say, okay, let's see if we can hit that reset button,
Mm,
3 or 4 times during the day. Let's see if we can hit it at those witching hour moments, the just
yeah.
after school moments, the getting ready for dinner moments, the pre bedtime moments. Let's see if we can step in with those. But with children who are really, really struggling, I'm talking more like, let's do this every 30 minutes,
Yeah.
which obviously becomes a challenge to do it that often as a parent. But just think about,
Yeah.
what can we do to just quiet this child's stress response system down,
Mm,
connect with them, help them to feel safe, and yeah, to just be doing that over and over again before they're
mm,
getting up to that place. So, when I think about the stress staircase, I sort of come at this in 3 different ways. So I think about, how can we come at from 3 different directions in a sense. So one is, from the outside in, what's going on in the child's life day after day throughout the day, that we could where we could decrease some stressors. And I'll talk about some of those, but kind of an outside in approach. Then we think about bottom up strategies. So
okay.
how do we go down into the bottom part of the brain and quiet that part down? And then the other, I'd say, sort of top down, some things that you can teach your child. So use their thinking to help them to manage.
Mm,
So if we think about that, at first, that kind of outside in, what can we, when we look at the child's life, so their week, their day, is there anything there? Well, how many situations are there that the child's struggling in? So are there situations where they are, um, well, I'd always have the question, are they overscheduled? Are there, is there enough, on the positive side, is there enough kind of structure and routine and predictability? Because those are all things that are going to help us to stay calm.
mm,
But is there kind of too much expected of the child? So you mentioned
yeah.
school.
Yeah.
Oftentimes our kids are trying to keep it together in a very difficult environment in school and then come home. But now we've got sports, or we've got some, maybe it's doctor visits or therapy visits
Hmm.
or other things, because you've got a
Piled
child
on.
that struggles. So let's look at their week. Is there too much going on there? And what we found over and over is, when we can take away those things which are stressors, the child will do better.
Mm,
So we become, we're pretty vigilant about this in our cases, to really think about, what can we take away here
mm,
that's adding to that sense of being overloaded for the child. How can we take those things out? So some things that we often come across, because we're working with kids that are often in foster care, or they're in, maybe adoptive situations where there's open adoption, but it's, things like visits with bio family.
mhm,
So that's something that we all value. We'd like to see kids stay connected with their families, but that's a very stressful kind of
mm,
thing. And one thing we've learned about kids who have, lived with complex trauma in their life, is that they don't reset down that stress staircase very
yeah.
easily. So they're not only running through the day high up there and on the upper ends of the stress staircase, but when they're stressed, they don't come back down
Mm,
very quickly. So I'm sure you all are aware of, your audience are aware of situations where there's some sort of family visit that's happening partway through the week, that is, the child's stress leading into it. And it might be a good visit. It might go okay, but there's stress
yeah.
leading into it,
There's a
and
lot
there's stress and
involved.
emotion afterwards.
Preparation. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it might be, often your foster parents saying, gosh, it's like 3 days out of our week just
That's
to
right.
manage this one kind of evening visit. It's
Yeah.
3 days out of our week, because there's, the preparation day, and then the day of, and then the day after. And those days are such a challenge.
Mm,
And when I think about kids who are, it's just a huge amount of stress to put in the child's life at that point. So we always think about, how can we manage that better?
mm,
So it might be thinking about, you know, decreasing how frequently those visits happen to help keep the visits as successful and um, attachment affirming as possible.
Yeah.
So think about
Yeah.
visits that are kind of
Quality.
short and sweet and
Hmm.
structured and effective for both the parent and the bio parent and the child.
Yeah.
Um, but that would be an example of something to look at. So looking at the child's life, are do they have too many events that they're having to cope with through the week? So there's not enough kind of downtime and quiet time and opportunities to reset and opportunities to really be with the main caregivers or parents that are going to be the ones that are kind of provide the security that they need. So I think about one
Yeah.
case now where the girl's in, full-time school, and then she goes to after-school care for 2 or 3 hours, and then she's got appointments on top of that, and then
Yeah.
she's got some sports on top of that, and then was going to a therapy program on a Saturday
Mm.
to learn some social skills, and all that accumulation. Each of those situations is hard for her. So that accumulation meant that she didn't get enough of the attachment time she needed, and was never had time to kind of recoup and
Gotcha.
kind of quiet down. Right? So that's the kind of
Yeah. You're
outside in
thinking
of
about like
what's going on.
rhythms of life, right? And the pace at which that rhythm needs to travel in a kid's life who has significant hardship that has created a hyperactive nervous system needs more often less stimulus, right?
Yes,
So yeah,
exactly,
okay. More
exactly.
opportunity and slower amounts of time. I see that too. Where it's like, well, we have every Wednesday off, but I also see kids who can't adapt well, right? I hear like there's another word for this staircase would be adjustment. How do I move fluidly through up and down something based on how I'm experiencing the world, right? And if I don't have internally the ability to adapt or adjust from moment to moment, then I need to stay longer in each moment, right? To be able to
Yes.
get that. So just having a day off a week, but then cramming everything on weekends also doesn't work, right?
No, because they keep all together and you add it all up, it's too
Right.
much. And we
It's
we
too much.
found over and over again very challenging children in situations that are referred to us. If we
Mm.
do two things well, we're going to see progress.
Okay.
One is if we can just we're fighting against stress. So how can we decrease the amount of stress that the
Yeah.
child's experiencing? And the second is how can we deepen the attachment?
Yeah.
If we do those two things, we call those our therapeutic bookends. If we do those two things, we're going to see the child grow and develop, and we're going to
Mm.
see you know less of the kind of meltdowns and emotional challenges. We're going to see better behavior. We're going to lots of different things out of
Yeah.
those two roots.
Yeah.
So I mentioned the kind of outside in. So then let's talk a little bit
Yeah.
about kind of sort of bottom up.
Okay.
So this sort of follows the ideas that from Dr. Bruce Perry that children need. If we can introduce patterned, repetitive, rhythmic stimulation,
Mm.
that's calming and organizing for the child, and it's
Mm.
organizing for the brain. So we're looking at ways to kind of have this um, to use sensory, positive, pleasurable sensory activities.
Yeah.
So whether it's touch, whether it's sound, whether it's movement, whether it's
Hmm.
smell, to help the child kind of come down into a quiet place. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One foster parent taught me this. Actually, she talked about how her little boy, I think he was about 8 at the time, would get quite wound up and was couldn't slow down and seemed to be almost hyperventilating. And she'd throw a big towel in the dryer and just warm it
Hmm.
up, and then she'd take that towel and she'd wrap it around him really tight and give him a big hug. And she said, I could just feel the tension going out of his body,
Drop. Yeah.
tension dropping. And that's exactly what we're looking for. That almost that big
Mm.
exhale.
Hmm. That
Ah,
deep pressure gives
that
that release.
yes. So the
Yeah.
warmth, the deep pressure. Now another
Yeah.
child might not like that, but they might
That's
like
right.
something
Yeah.
else. We've got kids where, our entree to them might be taking some lotion and rubbing it on their hands,
Mm.
and that we're doing that not just because we want to have lotion on their hands so they don't have dry hands, but because this is a tactile
Soothing.
experience. It's
Mm.
soothing, and so we'll tell parents, all right, the 1 minute that you normally take to do that, could you take 5 minutes? Could you stretch that out? And oftentimes the parents sort of caregivers face to face with the child during that time, which is really special. In
Mm.
addition to the touch, right? But it's the idea of how can we use sensory experiences to quiet the child down. And this is where that detective idea comes in.
Yeah.
What does your child like and respond to? What can you do where you can just feel that
Yeah.
coming out of them, right? And
Yeah.
there's some, we also use some with kids that are quite, where movement's really helpful.
Hmm.
I have a sequence that I heard about in a school that I really liked. Is move, work, breathe. I got a
I
number of
love
homes
that.
where we do this. Move.
Yes.
We're gonna, so within a 5 minute period of time, we're gonna move. We're gonna do some work, and then we're gonna breathe. And I'll
Mhm.
describe that. So at every transition point, you mentioned earlier, kind of these transitions and how kids have struggled with that. So at every transition point between one activity and another, with certain children, we're going to do this move, work, breathe. So move might be to do jumping jacks for 30 seconds.
Yeah.
High energy, high energy, high energy. Run in place, do jumps. Then we stop and we shake it all out, and then we do work, which might be a tension release kinds of things. So these are
Hmm.
easy to do. You could, if you're at home, you could go over to the wall, and you're doing this with the child you care for. Go to the wall and push the wall. Everybody push, push, push.
Yep.
And we push for 15 seconds. And then we stop and we shake out our hands and we take a deep breath, and then breathe, move, work, breathe. We want to take some deep breaths, deep slow breaths,
Awesome.
and then go back and do it again. So move, work, breathe. And it's kind of high intensity, and
Yeah.
then that shake it out,
Yeah.
the wiggles out. Take that deep breath, and oftentimes that sequence is quieting to the body, and quiet along with that, and kind of quieting to the child's nervous system.
We've moved and adapted through some of our strategies at home, but I that actually reminds me of like I when you're in this community, we know other parents who are doing this, right? And so we chat back and forth because we get each other. So, sometimes I remember years ago a friend who has several foster kids and has adopted a few children as well, and she lives in Alberta, and she um, out of the blue had texted me a picture of her child trying to pick up a fridge, like a 3-year old, right? And she's like, "We're at it again. It's one of those days." And and I remember thinking, I know exactly that would make no sense to anybody, but those of us who were in it, because I knew exactly this was not just a random, she set this up as a strategy. Hey, could you go get me the fridge? Because that lifting, that pressure, that thing that of resistance actually released whatever was going on for that child.
Yes.
So similar to the door frame, right? That was a common one for us, is like, go sit in the door frame. She was just the right height. Her legs were just the right length. Push on that. Push her back against the,
Push, push, push.
yeah, push, push, push. And can you do it longer? Can you do it harder? Can you do it right? Let's set a timer and see how long you can do it. It was like this challenge, and engage them in a different way. And yeah, I remember how unique those things felt, because this is not a parenting strategy everybody uses, but we knew each other's language. We spoke that language, but and now
Yeah.
we've moved into that. So that was old school for us. But now we're into dance and drumming, because for our kid, it's anything that feels rejecting or constricting. So she walks through her whole day worried that she's not going to be accepted. That containment of behave, behave, behave in order to be like that is a hard continuum, right? And
Mm-hmm.
we don't want that defining. But she comes home having felt that pressure all day, and then she wants to release and just be free, and often that comes out in behaviors that harm other people's sense of freedom. And so channeling that becomes, how do you move freely? So she'll put on some kind of dance program and she'll just let loose, and nobody criticizes that. Nobody gets in her space. It's like, give her the living room, let her be as loud as she needs to be, and an hour later she's calm and regulated and responsive, right? So it's like,
Yes.
those are the new things, but I get that.
Um, yeah, I think one of the things that I want to talk about is the kind of the difference between, let's call it, high energy movement slash recreation, and the place of that compared to these kind of calming strategies, which would
Okay.
may have that um, like that repetitive, rhythmic, sensory input, like that
Yeah.
pattern, repetitive rhythmic piece. So I think lots of times we've got kids with high energy, and so parents or caregivers are saying, "I found I just need to run them, right? And if I just kind of get
Mm-hmm.
them, I'm trying to burn off the energy."
Mm-hmm.
And there's certainly some kids are going to respond really well to that. So it sounds like your daughter responds really well to that, just kind of freely being able to kind of let loose physically, and probably at the end of that she's got these endorphins, positive
Yeah.
endorphins that are helping her mood, and she's got that released stress through that activity.
Mhm.
What we I think one of the things that we see is that we've got this idea that if I just keep them busy and kind of
Yeah.
recreation,
That's different.
that's coming, and that's a little bit different. I think
Yeah.
that we're trying to find things that have uh, that reset quality, that and that patterned, repetitive, rhythmic stimulation.
Yes.
So, for instance, having a child, sending them outside to play basketball, you think, okay, well, that's got some rhythmic pieces to it because they're bounce, bounce, bounce the
Mhm.
ball. But most, if you watch kids play basketball, most of the time spent running, chasing after the ball,
Yes.
and that's not the same
That
kind
is for me. If I play basketball, I'm spending way more time picking that thing up off the ground. Yeah.
yeah. Whereas if we had that same child spend 5 minutes on a treadmill, or
Yeah.
to be doing some swimming and not just playing around in the pool, which is great, that's the recreation side of it,
Yeah.
but to do some laps where they get the pattern, rhythmic,
Yeah.
repetitive movement, that it's those pieces, the pattern, repetitive, rhythmic piece, that can be very calming and helps the brain to organize. So we're
Mm.
always trying to find kind of a balance between those two different things.
Yeah.
Um, so around this, in terms of finding those things, as being that detective, what does your child like? What do they respond to? I think about deep pressure, which we were talking about in terms of the move work part is kind of could be sort of a deep pressure. You can do stretching.
Yeah.
That gets that proprioceptive response. So you might use bits of yoga. All of this, I think, works way better if the caregiver is doing it along with your child,
Mm.
because then now it's side by side. It's relational if possible, and it's not sort of sending the child off to go do his calming exercises. Right. This is no, we're doing this together, and
Yeah.
we've got lots of caregivers who kind of we're trying to ask them to say, "Hey, I'm feeling stressed. Would you help me with this? What do you think I could do
Yeah.
right now to bring down my stress?" And the child says, "Well, I think you need to do a move or three. I
Yes.
think you're right. Okay, well, what should we do for the work? What do you think would be good for me for the move part?" And so the child's learning and contributing and doing it in
Mhm.
parallel with you, which brings in the attachment piece as well.
And self-esteem, right? They are contributing, not being told what to do.
Yes, exactly.
Such a different position to be in for a kid. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to touch on one other thing just in terms of the bottom up. So again,
Yeah.
earlier on I talked about children where we knew there were issues during pregnancy,
Yeah.
we knew there were issues soon after after the child was born, and especially if you see sensory kinds of challenges, right? So the
Hmm.
child's has difficulty with the tags on their clothing and the texture of foods and all those kinds of things that
Yeah.
would make you think, okay, they've got some sensory stuff going on. I really like the idea of that at night we have this a bit of a captive audience with the child. And what we've done over and over again is try to introduce patterned, repetitive, rhythmic stimulation through the night. So I'll give you an example of a little 4-year-old boy who was adopted, and the parents said to us right off the bat, he never sleeps more than an hour and a half at a time, and then he's up for
Hmm.
hours. We are exhausted. He has to sleep in our room with us because the separation bothers him. But really, if we're lucky, if he gets 90 minutes, and then he's up and he wakes us up,
Yeah.
so exhausted. So what we did with him is we looked at his history and we saw, okay, all of these issues during pregnancy where mom was under a huge amount of stress and
Hmm.
fearful and using substances, so he wasn't getting that kind of
Yeah.
that
Rhythm.
rhythm. And so what we do is we love this idea of the stuffy, or there's something called a heartbeat puppy. You can get these little puppies that have
Mm.
a sound of a heartbeat in that. So we got a heartbeat puppy for this little boy, and within a few days, the parents called us up and they said he is sleeping through the night.
Dr. Geddes' magic wand. This is like, right? Like, woo,
It
sign
feels
me
like
up.
it.
I'll pay thousands of dollars for that one to get my night's sleep. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, actually, that so we I think I tell that story in my book, and I had
Yeah.
a family from Australia contact me, and they said we had a similar kind of situation. Just
Yeah.
that the child woke up angry first thing in the morning
Yep.
every morning,
Yep.
and so they did that same thing. So we put in this. They started using something like that, doing a heartbeat is what the child's hearing, which they missed out on, right?
Yeah,
So in
that's
all
right.
those,
A
so during
regulated
their development,
heartbeat.
they missed the
Hmm.
regulated heartbeat, and so we're trying to provide that to them for 6 hours a night,
Mm.
8 hours a night, and it's amazing how calmer they are. They wake up in the morning happier, And so then your first engagement with them in the morning is positive rather than being, a fight.
Yeah.
Anyway, I had a family from Australia who said, "Oh, I read that story and I tried something like that, and
Oh,
it's transforming things for us." So that's pretty cool.
I love that. And it's one of the things that I love most about the book that you wrote is how practical it is. I had the chance to be part of your book launch, and I remember reflecting on, um, if I could kind of describe the quality of, or the way in which you wrote this book, it feels like the plane hit the runway. There's so much good stuff in there. Um, but often we read good stuff and don't know how to apply it. And I thought you did such a great job of helping us see where the rubber meets the road and what we can actually do with that information. And today's no different. You've provided a lot of good examples of what that would sound like, look like, feel like to implement strategies that actually help us move our child's baseline on that staircase. Um, we've got a couple minutes here before we have to wrap up, but I was hoping that we could talk a little bit about something that I commonly see in particular for the I want to talk about this in particular for this conversation around trauma and experience in trauma, because there are lots of types of therapy that work directly with a child for specific mental health challenges. When it comes in particular to trauma, more and more I am leaning toward working with parents and less directly with the child, because what does 1 hour once or twice a week do for a child in the presence of someone who is not their primary attachment, right? And so I feel like the bang for the buck is working with the parents, because whoever's in charge of caring for that child has access to them 24/7. Um, and it's so much more important that that parent or caregiver feels the sense of support so that they know what they're doing directly with their child. Um, can you talk about, does this feel true to you in your clinical practice? Does this make sense as a framework that that's where we need to be implementing our resources as opposed to primarily working directly with the child?
Oh, 100% agree with you on that one,
Okay.
Karen. Um, if you think about one of the things we sort of think about is how do we create these developmental opportunities for the child to grow
Yeah.
and to develop? Because often they're sort of stuck at different places. How do we help them to move, to grow, and move forward? And I think about all the therapeutic moments that can
Mm.
happen
Mm.
with your parent, with
Yeah.
your main caregiver. That's where those therapeutic moments are going to happen, and that's where the child's really going to start to grow and develop. And so, you may need some coaching around that. But how
Yeah.
do you get to this place where it might feel like a big struggle to a place where you feel like you have these therapeutic moments happening? But
Yeah.
that's the 24/7, over
Yes.
and over and over with the people they're most connected and attached to. I know that some of you are struggling, some of your audience are struggling with kids where it feels like you just can't quite get attached there. I understand that that's part of it,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
overall, we want to see those therapeutic moments happening. So that's the child feeling listened to. That's the child having you express empathy and validation for the feelings.
Yeah.
That's the child feeling calm in your presence. All of that is going to be, I think, will far outweigh anything they could get from an individual therapist in an office.
Right.
Now, there's a time and place for that, I think,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
but but I think for most of your audience, most of the people we work with, they want to send the child there first. And to
Mhm.
me, often the kids that are referred to us, they're struggling developmentally far beyond. Like if you think about their chronological age and their
Yeah.
developmental age, they're
Yes.
half their chronological age. So it's a
Right.
12-year-old, but underneath they're really more like a 5, 6-year-old. How are we
Yeah.
going to help that 5 or 6-year-old to heal and to move and
Mm.
to grow? It's through these moment after moment of therapeutic experiences. It's
Totally.
not a 1 hour a week with a therapist. Now, will that help at some point down the road?
Mhm.
Down the road, yes, but we don't. I can't think of a case where we went looking for a therapist to start with.
Yeah.
Our what we've seen over and over. We've worked with about 350 children and teens across the province of BC, and what we've seen is that we see actually quite astounding growth and movement for kids over and over and over again without there being any kind of outside therapist. So
Yeah.
just working at those adults that are close, the closest connected, and how do we help you to make those, turn those into therapeutic moments, over and
Yeah.
over.
Well, I guess, yeah. And what I want parents to hear is that as therapists trying to support your child or the child in your care, we are not looking at you as though you have failed them in some way if you're the one coming to us for support, right? So I think that might be a barrier. People are assuming that we think the same way about this. That's not how we're thinking about it, right? That you haven't failed by saying, I'm the one who needs to be in a helping spot here. I need some support from people. We're not viewing that as, well, of course you do because you're not doing a good enough job. That is not the frame, right? The frame is, it's because you are ideally positioned to actually be the most powerful healer in that child's life. And so we need you, right? We need that. And so that's how we view it. But I love
Yeah,
that. I love how you frame that. That was really
and and
helpful.
and it really, it's a really nice way to describe that too. That you are the most important person in the child's life, and the one who
Yeah.
can be that healing agent for your child,
Yeah.
and that, um, you know, if typical parenting strategies work for these atypical
Huh,
kids,
right?
we'd all be
Yeah.
doing fine.
That's
But they
right.
don't. So the
Yeah.
things you learned growing up, the things you've tried, if they're not working, it's just because these are challenging kids.
Yeah.
And so we would want to provide you with tools and understanding to, so that you can become that best sort of therapeutic person in the child's life. And yeah, that's when we're going to see them
Excellent.
take off.
So good. Thank you for today's time again. I appreciate you adding to the original episode, and I'm now able to actually add a link to where people can purchase the book, because everything we've talked about today um, is embedded in that. And so if this resonated with listeners, I would encourage them to go purchase a copy of the book. Um, I really believe it's not going to disappoint. So please go and check that out. Um, and we'll link it to the show notes. And we've also talked about the stress staircase throughout today's episode and the image that comes with that. If you have subscribed to my living room learning page or to the podcast page, you will receive a copy of that, which is printable. So I'm going to make sure that I attach that. Thank you, Dr. Geddes, for providing that for us. And I hope you have a great week. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much.